The freezing rain poured relentlessly, soaking his frail, trembling body. He didn't move. He didn't want to live anymore. The German shepherd, once loved and cared for, was now alone, abandoned on the side of a desolate road. The people he trusted had betrayed him. His dull eyes reflected a single thought: it was over. Then headlights pierced through the darkness. But would someone finally stop? Or would it be just another indifferent soul, leaving him to freeze and be forgotten? What happened next changed everything in the most unbelievable way. The rain came down in relentless sheets, soaking everything in its path. The night air was sharp, the wind howling through the empty stretch of road, carrying the bitter cold with it. Each drop hit the asphalt with a harsh slap, pooling into dark puddles that reflected the distant glow of streetlights. Curled up on the muddy shoulder of the road, a German shepherd lay still, his frail body pressed against the cold ground. His fur, once thick and full, was now soaked through, clinging to his emaciated frame. His ribs jutted out sharply beneath his patchy coat, his muscles too weak to carry him anymore. But he wasn't trying to move, not anymore. His amber eyes, once filled with life, had dulled. His ears, which once stood tall and alert, drooped lifelessly against his head. His breath came slow, uneven, barely visible in the freezing air. He had fought for as long as he could. He had chased after their car, paws skidding against the pavement, his lungs burning as he ran after them. His heart had pounded so hard in his chest, certain they had made a mistake, that if he could just reach them, they would stop. But they never stopped. He had waited. 4 hours, 4 days. Every car that passed made his ears flick, his head lift just slightly before falling again in disappointment. They weren't coming back. The hunger had come first, then the exhaustion, then the cold. And now? He felt nothing at all. His body had given up before his heart did. But even that was fading now. The steady downpour continued to hammer against him, plastering his fur to his bony frame. The mud beneath him grew colder, seeping into his skin. His paws were stiff, unresponsive. He wasn't sure when he had last stood. A dim light flickered in the distance. Headlights. Another car. He had stopped watching them go by. He had stopped hoping. This one was no different. The tires splashed against the wet pavement, slowing down as they neared. The glow from the headlights spread over him, illuminating his thin, shaking form. Then something changed. The car didn't keep driving. It stopped. The low rumble of the engine vibrated through the night, idling. A door opened. Footsteps crunched against the wet gravel. Slow, careful. A shadow moved toward him, hesitating before kneeling beside his body. Warm fingers pressed lightly against his ribs. A sharp intake of breath. Oh my God. The voice was soft, almost drowned out by the rain. Feminine, concerned. He barely reacted. A hand brushed over his head, moving damp fur away from his dull eyes. The touch was light, hesitant, but not cruel. The figure shifted, crouching lower. A jacket rustled. You poor thing. Warmth. Something soft draped over him. A coat, heavy with body heat. The sudden contrast made his skin prickle. His muscles twitch involuntarily. Then gentle hands slid underneath him, lifting. For a split second, a weak instinct flared in his mind. His body stiffened slightly. His breath hitched, but he was too weak to resist, too far gone to care. You're not dying here, the voice said again, firmer this time. Then for the first time in days, he felt himself being carried. The motion rocked him, his head lolling against a warm shoulder. He barely noticed the rain anymore. A car door opened. The smell of leather. The faint scent of something familiar. Something safe. The hands didn't let go. A soft towel was pressed around him, a barrier against the cold. The car door shut, enclosing them in warmth. The engine hummed softly as the car pulled away. For the first time since they had left him, he let his eyes close. For the first time, he wasn't alone. The inside of the car was warm, but Emily's hands were ice cold as they gripped the steering wheel. The German shepherd lay motionless in the passenger seat, wrapped in the thickest towel she had in the back of her car. Her heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't tell if he was breathing. The wipers worked furiously against the downpour, blurring the world outside. The highway stretched into the distance, dark and empty, except for the occasional street lamp casting ghostly light over the rain-slick pavement. She stole a glance at the dog. His fur was drenched, clinging to his skeletal frame. His ribs stuck out so sharply that they cast faint shadows under the dim interior light. His paws were limp, caked in mud. He didn't shiver. That scared her the most. She had seen dogs in bad shape before. Neglect cases, strays too afraid to trust humans. But this was different. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't trying to live. Emily swallowed, forcing herself to breathe. "Come on, buddy," she murmured, tightening her grip on the wheel. "Stay with me." The road ahead curved, and she pressed the gas a little harder. Her mind raced. She wasn't supposed to stop tonight. She had been heading home after a long shift at the clinic. She had seen too many animals today. Some she saved, some she didn't. Her body ached with exhaustion, and she had promised herself she wouldn't take in another stray. But then she saw him, curled up in the freezing mud, barely holding on, and suddenly nothing else mattered. The tires skidded slightly as she pulled into her driveway, the engine rumbling as she threw the car into park. The rain was still pouring, hammering against the roof of the car like impatient hands. She turned to the passenger seat. The dog still hadn't moved. Emily's chest tightened. Too late. She didn't let herself finish the thought. Instead, she reached over and pressed 2 fingers gently against his chest. A heartbeat. Weak. Faint. But there, a sharp breath escaped her lips, and she moved fast. She flung the door open, racing to the other side. The moment she touched him, she could feel how cold he was. His body was like ice beneath the towel, his soaked fur offering no protection from the elements. Emily gritted her teeth. "You're gonna be okay," she said, more to herself than him. She slid her arms under his frail body and lifted him, cradling him against her chest. He barely reacted. She had treated dogs that snapped and fought, even in their weakest moments. But not him. This dog had given up. Emily pushed through the rain, rushing toward the porch. The lights from inside cast a warm glow against the storm, welcoming but distant. Her front door swung open before she could reach it. Jesus, Em. What the hell happened? Her best friend and roommate, Mark Spencer, 35, stood in the doorway, eyes wide with concern. His dark hair was tousled, his flannel pajama pants loose around his legs. Emily didn't stop. "Help me get him inside," she said, pushing past him. Mark stepped back as she carried the dog straight to the living room. The house was warm, the heat turned up high, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. She gently placed the dog on a thick blanket in front of the fireplace. Mark crouched beside her, running a hand through his hair. Is he even alive? Emily ignored him, already moving. She grabbed another towel, pressing it against the dog's fur, trying to dry him off as best she could. His breathing was shallow, but it was there. "He's alive," she said, more firmly than she felt. Mark exhaled, rubbing his face. "You're gonna keep him, aren't you?" Emily didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because she did. She had already made her choice. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the living room. The storm outside still raged, rain pelting against the windows. But inside, the air was thick with stillness. Emily knelt beside the German Shepherd, watching his frail chest rise and fall in shallow breaths. She had wrapped him in thick blankets, but he was still ice cold to the touch. His fur remained damp despite her efforts, and every time she ran the towel over his body, she winced at how thin he was. His ribs jutted out like sharp ridges, and the patches of missing fur exposed raw skin underneath. It had been a long time since someone had cared for him. Mark stood behind her, arms crossed, his brows furrowed in concern. "He's not moving much," he muttered. "That's not good, right?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pressed the back of her fingers gently against the side of the dog's face. His ears twitched slightly. That tiny movement sent relief through her chest. "He's alive," she said. "That's enough for now." Mark exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "Yeah, but for how long?" Emily ignored him. She grabbed a small bowl of warm water and a sponge, then carefully began cleaning the dirt and mud from his paws. Each one was stiff, unresponsive, too weak to fight her, too weak to care. Her heart clenched. She had seen dogs like this before. Not all of them made it. She refused to let that happen to him. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Emily barely noticed the time. She worked in silence, carefully warming his body, massaging his paws, and checking for injuries. At some point, Mark left the room, but she didn't care. Her focus was on him, but the dog didn't react to anything. No flinching, no eye movement. It was like he was trapped somewhere far away. Finally, she reached for the bowl of water, dipped her fingers in, and gently pressed a few drops against his cracked lips. For a moment, nothing. Then his tongue flicked out. Emily held her breath. It was barely a movement, just the faintest instinct to react. But it was there. He wanted to live. She pressed the edge of the bowl closer to his mouth, tilting it slightly. Another flick of his tongue, then a sip. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her chest tighten with hope. She ran a hand over his head, her fingers barely grazing the soaked fur behind his ears. "You're safe now," she whispered. He didn't respond, didn't lift his head. But for the first time since she had found him, his body let out a slow, shaky breath. A surrender, a small, fragile sign of trust. Emily leaned back, exhaustion crashing over her. But she didn't move from the floor. Instead, she pulled the blanket up higher around him, making sure he was as warm as possible. And then finally, she whispered the words she already knew were true. "I'm not giving up on you." Outside, the storm continued. Inside, for the first time in days, he wasn't alone. Morning light as it filtered through the curtains, casting a golden glow across the wooden floor. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the occasional drip of water from the roof and the damp scent of rain-soaked earth. Emily sat cross-legged beside the German Shepherd, exhaustion settling into her bones. She hadn't slept. Not really. Every time she closed her eyes, her mind snapped awake. Her instincts tuned into his breathing, his movements, any sign that he was slipping away. But now as she watched him, she noticed something different. His chest rose and fell with more steadiness. His body, once curled up so tightly in self-defense, was a little looser beneath the blankets. His ears twitched at small sounds. Mark clinking a spoon in the kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator. He was still weak, still dangerously thin, but he was here. Emily exhaled, allowing herself a small moment of relief. Then a sound, software, barely there, but real. She froze. Her gaze snapped to the dog's face. He had made a sound. It wasn't a growl or a whimper, just a small, tired exhale, like a sigh. Her chest tightened. She wanted to believe it was a sign, that he was acknowledging her presence, that he knew he wasn't alone anymore. Slowly, carefully, she reached out. Her fingers brushed against his forehead, moving toward his ear, and for the first time he flinched. It wasn't much, just the slightest jerk of his head, a twitch in his muscles. But it was the first time he had reacted to touch. Emily pulled her hand back, heart pounding. She knew what that meant. This wasn't just about neglect. This dog had been hurt before. Mark leaned against the kitchen doorway, a steaming mug in his hands. "You're getting attached." Emily didn't turn to look at him. She already knew what she would see, his raised eyebrow, the knowing look in his eyes. Instead, she focused on the dog. "I'm not," she said. Mark snorted. "Right, because staying up all night with him was just casual curiosity?" Emily sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. I can't leave him like this." Mark walked over, handing her the mug. She took it, feeling the warmth seep into her cold fingers. "He's not the first rescue you brought home," he said, "and he won't be the last. But this one feels different." Emily swallowed, because it was different. She could feel it. Something about him, his silence, his exhaustion, the way he had just given up. It was haunting. She looked at the dog again, and that's when she saw it. A scar, faint but long, running just behind his shoulder blade. Emily frowned. She shifted slightly, careful not to startle him, and gently lifted the fur around it. It wasn't a fresh wound. It had been healed for a long time, but it was deep, too precise to be an accident. Emily's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a stray. This dog had a past, and someone, somewhere, had left a mark on him that wasn't just physical. The sun had fully risen by the time Emily stepped outside, pulling her coat tighter around her body. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth lingering after the storm. The world felt new, like the night before had been washed away. But inside her chest, something heavy remained. She glanced back at the house. Through the window, she could see the German shepherd lying on the blanket near the fireplace. His body still weak, but his breathing steady. The scar on his shoulder wouldn't leave her mind. She had seen scars before. Old wounds, healed injuries, evidence of past pain. But this one had a precision to it. This wasn't an accident. Someone had hurt him. Emily clenched her jaw. She needed answers. Inside, the soft crackle of the fire filled the silence. The dog was awake, his eyes half open, watching her cautiously, not trusting, but not running either. Emily knelt beside him, careful to move slowly. "Hey, buddy," she murmured. "You hanging in there?" He didn't react, but he was listening. She set a small bowl of soft food in front of him. It wasn't much, just something gentle for his stomach, but she didn't expect him to eat right away. For a moment he stared at it, then slowly his nose twitched. Emily held her breath, a single movement, a tiny instinct. Then he licked at the food, not a bite, not a meal, but a taste. It was the first time he had eaten anything since she found him. Her chest tightened. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just let him take his time. After a few moments, he stopped, lifting his head again. His gaze met hers. Emily's breath caught. It was barely a glance, just a flick of his tired amber eyes before he looked away. But it was something. She swallowed against the sudden lump in her throat. She had been rescuing animals for years. She had seen dogs in worse conditions, had patched up broken bones, and stitched up wounds. But this was different. This wasn't just a rescue. This was something deeper, something aching, and she was terrified of it. Mark sat across from her at the kitchen table, his coffee steaming in front of him. "You think he belonged to someone?" he asked, frowning. Emily nodded slowly. "I'm sure of it. He has a scar. It's clean, almost surgical, and he's not reacting like a stray would. He's, waiting for something." Mark took a sip of his coffee, setting the mug down with a quiet thud. "So what now?" Emily rubbed her temples. "I don't know. You're keeping him," she sighed. "I don't know that either," Mark smirked. "Yeah, you do." Emily exhaled, glancing toward the living room. The dog was still there, his head resting on his paws. His body, though frail, had relaxed slightly. The blankets around him weren't just covering him now. He had buried himself into them, like maybe he was finally allowing himself to believe he was safe. She swallowed. She had promised herself she wouldn't get attached. But looking at him now, she knew it was too late. She was already his. The morning air was sharp, crisp with the lingering chill of last night's storm. The ground was still damp, the scent of wet earth heavy in the air. Emily stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed against the cold, watching the German shepherd lying near the fireplace inside. For the first time since she had found him, he wasn't asleep. He was watching her, not with fear, not with hesitation, just watching. It was enough. She took a breath. "Come on, buddy. Let's get some fresh air." It took time. At first, he didn't want to move. His legs were still weak, and every step seemed to take effort. But Emily didn't rush him. She stood beside him, waiting. And then slowly, he followed her. She walked across the yard and he stayed at her side. Not because she was leading him, because he chose to. Her heart clenched at the realization. They moved in silence. The soft crunch of damp leaves underfoot, the only sound between them. The wind ruffled his fur, and he lifted his nose slightly, as if drinking in the scent of the world he had been shut away from for so long. Then he stopped. Emily slowed, turning toward him. "What is it?" His ears twitched. Then his head snapped up. His muscles went rigid. His eyes locked onto something beyond the trees. Emily's pulse quickened. "Hey, what is it?" But he wasn't listening. He took a step forward, then another, and then he bolted. "Wait!" Emily sprinted after him, her boots slipping against the damp ground. The dog moved with purpose, not hesitation, not panic. He knew where he was going. The realization sent a chill down her spine. She had seen him lost. She had seen him broken. But this wasn't random. He was going home. The trail opened onto a narrow road, lined with trees still dripping from the storm. The German Shepherd skidded to a stop, his chest heaving, his amber eyes locked on something in the distance. Emily followed his gaze and froze. A house, not abandoned, not empty, and standing at the edge of the driveway, staring back at them with wide, disbelieving eyes. A man. Emily's breath caught. The dog didn't move. The man didn't move. And then, "Ranger?" The word was barely a whisper, but the dog heard it. He heard it. And before Emily could even react, he ran, straight toward him. Emily stood frozen, her heart hammering as the German Shepherd sprinted toward the man. He didn't hesitate, didn't look back, didn't pause to reconsider. He knew him, the man, mid-40s, tall, with short brown hair graying at the temples, dropped to his knees, his hands trembling. His breath curled in the cold air as his mouth opened. But no words came out. The dog crashed into him, not cautiously, not hesitantly, with everything he had left. Emily's chest tightened as she watched the sheer relief on both their faces. The shepherd, Ranger as the man had called him, pressed against him, bearing his face in his chest, his tail moving for the first time since she had found him. A low, broken whimper escaped the dog's throat. The man's arms wrapped around him, his fingers digging into his fur, pulling him impossibly closer. Emily swallowed the lump forming in her throat. This wasn't just a stray finding an old home. This was something deeper. She took a slow step forward. You know him." The man finally looked up, his eyes glassy with disbelief. He nodded. "His name is Ranger. He was my dog." His voice cracked. "I thought he was dead." Inside the man's house, the warmth was immediate. The fireplace flickered, the scent of pine filling the air. Ranger lay on a thick rug, his eyes half closed, but his body completely at ease. Emily sat across from the man. "Daniel Carter. He went missing 4 years ago," he explained, his voice heavy. "I was in an accident, a bad one. I was in the hospital for months." Emily nodded, letting him continue. "When I finally got out, I went back home. But Ranger was gone. My neighbor said he had been looking for me, waiting. But one night there was a storm, and when I got back, he had disappeared." Emily's stomach turned. "He was waiting for you." Daniel exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. "I searched for him everywhere. I posted flyers, called shelters, but nothing." His eyes flickered toward the scar on Ranger's shoulder. Emily followed his gaze. "You think someone took him?" she asked. Daniel's jaw clenched. "I don't know, but someone hurt him." Silence settled between them. Emily glanced at Ranger. He was finally home, finally warm, finally safe. Her chest tightened. This was what she had wanted for him, right? So why did it hurt so much? She stepped outside, letting the cold air bite at her skin. She needed a second, to breathe, to let him go. Footsteps sounded behind her. "You're leaving?" Emily turned. Daniel stood in the doorway, watching her carefully. She forced a smile. "Yeah, he's where he belongs." Daniel hesitated, then stepped forward. "You saved his life." Emily swallowed. "I just got him out of the rain." Daniel shook his head. You gave him a reason to fight." Emily let out a breath, looking away. "Listen." Daniel rubbed the back of his neck. "I owe you more than I can ever repay, but I also—" He hesitated, then gestured toward the house. "Ranger hasn't taken his eyes off you since you stepped outside." Emily stiffened. Slowly, she turned her head. Through the window, Ranger was watching her. His ears perked slightly. His body was relaxed, but his eyes held something else. Something she wasn't expecting. A question, a hesitation, a choice. Her throat tightened. Daniel exhaled, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think he has 2 homes now." Emily's breath caught, and when she stepped forward, Ranger wagged his tail. After 4 long years of waiting, through storms, hunger, and heartbreak, Ranger finally found his way home. But in the end, home wasn't just a place. It was the people who refused to give up on him. Emily could have driven past that road, ignored the lifeless figure in the rain, and never looked back. But one choice, one moment of kindness, changed everything. Because sometimes the ones we save end up saving us too. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications to see more powerful and inspiring stories like this one. And let us know in the comments, have you ever rescued an animal? Share your story with us.